chapter 5 is about histology or tissues. Some of this you've already done, so I'm going to review the things that are new that I didn't have in the adaptive or the Learn Smart activities. I pulled some of the stuff out of that. So one of the things is, whoops, wait a minute, where did my pencil go? Pencil writes sometimes and sometimes it doesn't. Okay, oh, I'm erasing. Okay, so tissues are groups of cells and extracellular material. So it's the stuff in between the cells. You have to remember that a tissue has a common function. So an example is providing protection. And when we study tissues, we call that histology. So I've been over this. There are 4 main types of tissues. And the book says con men. So you could say, sometimes we joke and we say semen. Okay, so connective, muscle, epithelial, and nervous. Okay, so the first one that we're going to talk about is epithelial. So epithelial tissue is also called epithelium. So the cells are really closely packed together. So they're tight. There's nothing that can, most of the time, nothing goes in between those cells. There's no extracellular matrix. They line cavities, they form glands, and they cover the surfaces of our body like our skin. Okay, so characteristics. So what are we always looking for and what do these cells do? So they're always attached to a basement membrane. So if we have a layer here, okay, and then the cells are on top of it. This is the basement membrane. Okay, so it provides a barrier between this and what's underneath of it. Okay, they don't have blood vessels. So they're going to obtain their nutrients from either up here, so coming from something above them, or coming from something below them. Okay, so this is the apical surface is at the top. Okay, and down here is the basement membrane, the basal surface. Okay, so the basement is the bottom and the apical is the top. Okay, now, epithelium has a lot of nerves. Okay, so it's sensitive to what's going on in the environment and they can regenerate. Okay, so they can go through mitosis. So mitosis, yes. Okay, so here's a picture. So characteristics of epithelium. So here is connective tissue. So here's the bottom, underneath. Okay, so the basement membrane is the bottom of the epithelium and then the apical surface is on the top. Okay, so here I want you to know some general functions. So one is protection. The one is secretion. Okay, and the other one, let's say, it says selective permeability, but let's say usually we say absorption. Okay, so it allows some things to come through. So protection, absorption, and secretion. Okay, also, your skin, right? It has sensations. Okay, now, epithelial tissue, the way we classify it is based on how many layers of cells. So simple epithelium just has 1 layer of cells. And we kind of talked about that before. Okay, now if it only has 1 layer, it's going to secrete or absorb. Okay, now if it's got more than 1 layer, okay, we call it stratified. Okay, so stratified is, it's more protection. Okay, because you have many layers. So there's some sort of stress going on. Now, pseudostratified is not quite layered. Okay, so if you look at it like this, here's the basement membrane, here's the apical surface, so here's the top. Not everything touches the top. Okay, so it kind of goes like this. Okay, so not everything goes all the way to the top. Okay, now we also classify epithelial tissue by shape. And you guys have been through this because you went through some of the lab stuff, right? So squamous, they're flat and irregular. Sometimes I think of them as fried eggs. Okay, and the nucleus is kind of flat. Okay, cuboidal cells, This one I always think of Lido's pizza, because Lido has the square pieces of pizza. And that's, if you get pepperonis, the pepperonis look like the nucleus. Okay, columnar are in columns. And transitional, these guys are going to change their shape depending on what's going on. Okay, so here's the pictures that I really just drew for you. So simple, one layer. Okay, and these are squamous because they're kind of egg-shaped, kind of like that. Not really egg-shaped, but they look like fried eggs. Okay, cuboidal are more square, right? And columnar are tall. So here's stratified. Okay, so this would be stratified cuboidal down here, and then that's stratified squamous. Okay, now here's the picture. In the book, they organize it so you can kind of visualize it. Depends on what kind of learner you are, right? But if you're somebody that has to see it all laid out, you can kind of see it like this. So here's epithelium. Okay, there's simple layer. So then we have simple squamous, simple cuboidal, simple columnar, and they're putting this pseudo stratified under there because it really is just one layer. It looks like it might be stratified, but it's not really. Okay, now stratified means we have more than one layer. So then we have stratified squamous. And we actually break it down into 2 layers, and I'll show you that in a minute. Okay, stratified cuboidal, stratified columnar, and then transitional. So this is a kind of a neat way to see it. Okay, now there's a slide for each one of these. Basically for these, what I want you to do, I want you to be able to recognize what the picture is, right? What it would look like. Okay, and I want you to understand the basic function of it and one good example of where you would find it. Okay, so simple squamous, it's flat, right? It's a really thin barrier, so that's going to allow for absorption, right? Things can go through it. It's really easy for particles to go through the one layer of cells in a basement membrane. Okay, I think the best place to look for it is the alveoli. Okay, so the alveoli are the sacs of the lungs. It's also in blood vessels, and it's in the membranes that line our body cavities. Okay, so simple cuboidal. So there's the square. Okay, absorption and secretion. You're going to find them in glands. Okay, simple columnar epithelium. So the cells are tall. Okay, there's two different forms. Okay, so they can have cilia on them, or they can't, or they don't necessarily have cilia on them. So if they don't have cilia, lots of times they have microvilli on them. So microvilli are just kind of like ruffles or extensions of the cytoplasm and the plasma membrane. So what they're going to do is they're going to increase the surface area so that you have more places for things to absorb or get through. Okay, so we have them in our, they end up looking fuzzy. So they call them a brush, like a paintbrush, a brush border. Okay, so we have them in our digestive tract. Okay, now there used to be this cool thing that they had at the fair where you would be they pretend like you're putting your hand in this tube. It was this big piece of PVC pipe, and they had it lined with velvet and like this long pile of velvet, and you could put your hand in there and pretend that you're feeling all these microvilli that would be in like a cow intestines. So it's pretend. Okay, now columnar epithelium has these cells, and it can have these cells. Not everything has it, that are called goblet cells. So goblet cells are cells that actually secrete. Okay, so some of them secrete mucus. Okay, now if they have a cilia, okay, that means they have the cilia on the surface so they can sweep. Okay, so these are found in our respiratory tract and in the uterine tubes. So in the respiratory tract, they're going to sweep anything that gets trapped in there up so you can swallow it and get rid of it. But they're also in the uterine tube, so they're going to move the egg. Okay, pseudostratified also has two kinds, ciliated and non-ciliated. I'm happy if you can recognize pseudostratified. Okay, so if you look at this, this is a good picture to look at. Okay, so here's the bottom. Everybody's touching the bottom, but not everybody's going all the way to the top. So like this one stops here, but these go all up, all the way up. Okay, so they're gonna protect and they're gonna secrete. Okay, so respiratory system. Okay, stratified squamous, we kind of talked about. Okay, so stratified squamous, here's a picture. Okay, so stratified squamous, the bottom looks more cuboidal. Okay, now if it has keratin in it, the cells towards the, kind of babbling. Okay, the cells towards the top can have keratin in them. Okay, so keratin is a protein. It's going to be found in your skin, so epidermis. So think about skin. So the keratin is going to help keep you dry and protect you. So if we go back, I'm trying to do this fast, and maybe that's not a good thing. Okay, so stratified squamous, so we have lots of layers, right? Lots of wet layers. At the bottom, they're more cubey. And at the top, they're very flat. Okay, stratified squamous cells are going to protect against abrasion and friction. So we have them lining openings. Okay, so you find them in the mouth, in the skin, in the anus and the vagina. Okay, so they're there to protect. Okay, if they have keratin, they're dry. Okay, and they're going to be in the skin. Okay, if they don't have keratin, they're going to be moist. Okay, and if they're moist, they're inside. So there are places that are moist, like the vagina, the anus, the esophagus, the mouth. Okay, the idea behind having all these layers is that if there's friction, layers can slough off, and there are more layers underneath of it that are going to help protect. Okay, stratified cuboidal, same idea, you just have multiple layers of cuboidal cells. Okay, their sweat glands is where you find them. Okay, and they're going to protect and secrete. Okay, transitional epithelium changes shape. Okay, so it can be in transition. So it's either looking kind of cubey, okay, or it's looking flat. The cells usually have two nuclei, which is funky, right? We don't have two nuclei. We always have one nucleus in cells. Okay, it's found in your urinary tract, especially your bladder. Okay, so basically what happens is when your bladder is empty, okay, the cells kind of shrink up. They're not all, but when your bladder is full, the cells stretch out. Okay, so it's going to look different depending on when you look at it. Okay, but it stretches and it's in the urinary tract. So transitional urinary tract stretches. Okay, now glands. This is one thing this is different, right? We haven't talked about glands yet. Okay, so glands, so they're broken down into two categories. Okay, so they're either endocrine or they're exocrine. They're made up of epithelial tissue, okay, both kinds. Now, endocrine glands are part of the endocrine system. So they don't have ducts, so no ducts coming out of them. And what they do is they're going to dump hormones into the bloodstream. Okay, so endocrine glands are things like your thyroid, your pancreas, okay, and we have a whole chapter 17. It's all about endocrine system. Okay, now exocrine glands have ducts. Okay, so what's going to happen is the epithelial cells are going to produce things for secretion, but they're going to dump them into these ducts, and then the ducts will dump them in someplace else. Okay, so examples of exocrine glands, so they're going to exit, right? They're exiting. So sweat glands, mammary glands, so think about milk, okay, and salivary glands, which are going to make saliva or spit, right? So they're all dumping out somewhere. Whoops, what's going on? Okay, now we have, there are different, in anatomy, we always are classifying things, right? We're organizing things. So that we either organize it by function or we organize it by what it looks like. So it depends on what's going on. So there's all these different classification systems. So the first thing we did is we organized it by how they dump, how they get rid of stuff, right? And where the stuff goes. The next way we organize it is by what they look like. Okay, I'm not worried that you can draw these. Okay, I just want to go over it quickly and no big deal. Okay, so exocrine glands can have many cells, right? And they can be anything from simple to pretty complex. Okay, so a simple gland, if you look, okay, it's just a bunch of cells, and the cells are going to make secretions, and then this stuff is going to get dumped out. And then they start to branch, okay? And then they start to coil, okay? And then they get wider and narrower. And then we get multiple branches, and they just get more and more complex, okay? I'm not too worried about this. We have bigger fish to fry. I just want you to know that these kinds of things exist. Okay, I left this in here. I didn't get rid of it. Okay, I just want you to know these exist. Okay, now, another way that they classify glands is by how they secrete. Okay, so there are merocrine glands, apocrine glands, and holocrine glands. Okay, so merocrine glands dump what they package what they're gonna dump in the vesicles, and then they exocytose them. So an example of a merocrine gland is a tear gland or a lacrimal gland or salivary gland. Okay, apocrine glands actually pinch off part of it, and that becomes the secretion. So that's mammary glands. Holocrine glands actually secrete the cells. Okay, so the cell slice. So those are sebaceous glands. I just want you to know these exist. I don't expect you to memorize what they do. So this is kind of like okay, it's here, but don't get hung up on this. Okay, so here's a picture of them. So here's merocrine, and it's just dumping, exocytosing, and dumping this stuff out. Here's apocrine. So that, see how this is kind of popping off of here, like that, and dumping that out. And then these holocrines, the cells actually are breaking apart and the secretions are coming out. So sebaceous glands, mammary glands, and salivary glands. Okay, now connective tissue. So connective tissue, they all have three things that we're going to look at, and that's how we categorize them. So they're going to have cells, right? They're going to have maybe protein fibers, and then they're going to have stuff that's in between the cells. Okay, so now they all have very specific types of cells. Most of the time, the cells are not tightly packed together. Okay, so they can be very loose. Sometimes they are, though. Okay, and then there's cells that stay in the same place all the time, and then there are some cells that kind of wander around. Okay, connective tissue has different kinds of fibers in them. Okay, so they're all made out of protein. One is called collagen. So collagen is really strong. They say cable-like, right? So C and C, so they're tough. So they're going to be found in your tendons and ligaments, and that keeps them together. Okay, now reticular fibers is, I always think reticular, like endoplasmic reticulum. So that's a network. Okay, so they are in your lymph nodes and they kind of provide this mesh network. And then elastic fibers, they kind of make sense, right? They have a protein called elastin and they're going to allow things to stretch and recoil. All right, this is kind of, what did I do? That looks weird. Okay, so the ground substance is the stuff that's in between the cells. Okay, so if this is a picture, right, and here's your cells, and then you have fibers in here. Okay, the ground substance is the stuff that's in between the cells. Okay, so sometimes they call that the extracellular matrix. Okay, but we're calling it ground substance. So when you go to identify connective tissue, you're looking at a couple things. You're looking to see what the cells look like. Okay, what do the cells look like? We're looking to see what the fibers look like. And then we're also looking at the ground substance. So that's what you're trying to key in on. Okay, so here's another picture of this. Okay, so here's the space in between. Okay, here's some cells. Okay, and then here's the other stuff that's in there, the fibers that are in there. And this, they give you the super busy one, right? So it's got fat cells, it's got blood vessels. I mean, it's not neat and tidy. Usually your body's not, there's lots going on. Okay, now, depending on what the connective tissue is, it has different functions. Okay, so it could be physical protection. It could provide support. It could hold things together. Okay, it could be for storage. So it could be for transport and it could be for immune. Okay, so let's go through them and we'll kind of hit the big picture things. Oh, I put this Marfan syndrome in here. So Marfan syndrome is a disease of connective tissue. So what happens is the connective tissue is very stretchy and kind of weak. So they figured out that it's on chromosome 15. And usually people that have it have really, really long fingers and toes and their limbs are long, they're tall. And what can happen to them, and they think maybe Abraham Lincoln had it, is they can have a weakness in the aorta and they can have abnormal heart valves because that connective tissue is damaged. Okay, they could also have weak tendons and joints, and they just try to manage it and make sure that they're checking everything and that, you know, they don't, that your aorta is not going to rupture or anything like that. Okay, so here's another nice chart with connective tissue. So, okay, so connective tissue, so we have connective tissue proper, and that divides into loose and dense. And then remember A, R, D, D, E. Okay, then we have supporting, so then we have cartilage, right? And then cartilage has 3 types. And then we have bone. And bone, there's 2 types of bone, and then there's blood and there's lymph. Okay, so here's loose connective tissue. So it's kind of fluffy. It's pretty loose. Okay, so there's AAR. So I always remember R like a pirate. Okay, so areolar. Okay, so it's got a lot of blood vessels in it. It's got lots of fiber in there. Areolar is right below the skin. Okay, so here, if this is epidermis, right? Okay, underneath of that is where you're going to find areolar tissue. I always think of it as subflooring. So if you think about in your basement, the layer between the floor and the basement, right? There's 2x4s and things running through there and lots of pipes and tubing. So that's where, or wires, that's the areolar layer. Okay, so it's going to provide space. Okay, adipose is fat. Okay, so stores energy. It's actually excess protection, right? Nice fluffy cells. Okay, reticular. I always think of this one as like one of those nylon net bass scrunchies. Okay, so it's this network. So here's the network of proteins, and then in there are blood cells. Okay, so white blood cells are in here. So lymph nodes. Okay, now proper connective tissue. So the dense, regular, dense, irregular, and the elastic. Okay, so these are tightly packed cells. And if you look, the cells are all going in the same direction. So they look like they're holding something together tight. It's kind of like duct tape, maybe. Okay, this says stacked lasagna noodles is what the book says. Okay, so they're all kind of going together. Okay, and they're going in one direction. They don't have a lot of blood vessels. So if you ever hear about somebody having a tendon or a ligament tear, right, it takes a long time for them to heal. It's because they don't have a blood supply. Okay, so they're holding things together. They're always going in the same direction. So if somebody turns it, it could separate and kind of get pulled apart. Okay, dense irregular. They say it looks like marbled meat. Okay, so it's like meat with fat in it. So it's kind of looks, I don't know, it's going in a whole bunch of different directions. It's not uniform and smooth like this is. So this is all smooth. And this, it's all going in a million different ways, right? So it's going to provide support, resistance in many different directions. Okay, so it's found under the skin, right? Under the epithelium. It's also in like around the organs. Okay, elastic connective tissue. So it's got these elastic fibers in it. So it's going to stretch. So we have it in places like the big arteries. So you could think of the aorta. Okay, then if we keep going, okay, we have supportive connecting tissue. Okay, so we're going to talk about cartilage. Okay, so cartilage cells are called chondrocytes. Okay, so chondrocytes, I always think they look like maybe owl eyes. Okay, so if you look here, you can see these little owl eyes. They kind of look like this, or maybe cartoon eyes. Okay, so what you're looking for, if you're looking for cartilage, is you're looking for something that looks like this. And then you're going to say, oh, that's cartilage. Okay, and then you look at what's in between the cartilage. And in this case, it's really clear. There's nothing in between it. When there's nothing in between it, that means it's hyaline. Okay, it's at the ends of the bones. It's in the fetal skeleton. The costal cartilage, this is the cartilage that attaches your ribs to your sternum. Okay, it's in your nose and your trachea and your larynx. But this is a good one to remember. Okay, fibrocartilage, so there's the ally again. Okay, and then there's the fibers in between it. Okay, they are tough. It's very tough. Okay, so weight-bearing cartilage. It resists compression, so it's almost like a shock absorber. Okay, so we're going to have them in the disc, in the intervertebral disc, so the disc between the vertebrae. It's part what your meniscus is made out of in your knees and the pubic symphysis. Okay, elastic cartilage. It's got these elastic fibers. So there's the owl eyes again, right? Okay, but then you have these fibers. They look more stringy to me. Okay, and then that's found in your external ear. Okay, now bone is more solid than cartilage, right? it's going to provide support. It's made out of organic components and it's made out of calcium. Bone cells are called osteocytes. Okay, we are going to talk about bone. It's got its own chapter. Okay, so there's compact bone and there's spongy bone. So compact bone is very dense. This is what compact bone looks like, kind of like a tree trunk. Okay, so compact bone is on the outside and spongy bone is kind of in the middle of the long bones. For right now, no, bones, their function is movement and support and really protection. Okay, now blood. Okay, so blood for right now, just know blood, it's responsible for transport. So transporting oxygen, carbon dioxide, glucose, other wastes. Okay, and in here, these are red blood cells. Okay, so we have a whole bunch of red blood cells, and then these are white blood cells. And we'll spend a whole bunch of time with blood cells. Blood has its own chapter too. Okay, now muscle. There are 3 types of muscle. Okay, so there's striated or skeletal muscle, and it's voluntary. Okay, so people use all 3 terms. Okay, so skeletal, striated, voluntary. It's going to be attached to bone. Okay, so if you look at it under the microscope, this is what it looks like. And I always think it looks like a salmon fillet. Okay, so if you go to the meat counter and you look in there, you can see this. It looks like salmon, right? So the striations, that's good enough for now. Just know that there's striations. Know that skeletal muscle is striated, and it's voluntary. So you have to think about it to move it. Okay, now cardiac muscle is also striated. Okay, but it's got these things in between the cells. Okay, and those things in between the cells are called intercalated discs. Those intercalated discs are junctions between the cells. So it allows the cells to communicate with each other and to stay bound together so that the heart doesn't come apart. Okay, the other thing about cardiac muscle cells is they're branched. Okay, so they're not just straight like skeletal muscle. Okay, smooth muscle is involuntary. Okay, so you can't think about and control your smooth muscles. It's part of your nervous response. So they're going to be part of your sympathetic and your parasympathetic nervous system, how we control them. Okay, so the big place to remember that they're going to be is in the GI tract. Okay, and we'll keep talking about this stuff. We'll go over all of it in more detail as we get to the individual chapters. Okay, nervous tissue. Okay, so this is an example of a neuron, and we'll go over all of this. Okay, so a neuron is part of the nervous tissue, right? It's part of your brain, part of your spinal cord, and then we have neurons that are going to communicate. We'll talk about the structure of these in a couple weeks. Okay, now organs are 2 or more tissue types, okay? And those types work together, okay? And then they're going to do a common function it's more complex than the tissue by itself. Okay, so here's an example. So the stomach has epithelium inside of it. The next thing it has is areolar and dense connective tissue, and it has smooth muscle in the walls, and then it's got nervous tissue in there too. Okay, so if you look at this and you cut a chunk out of it, okay, here's the mucosa, which is epithelial layers. Okay, then we have nerves in here. Then we have muscle. And then we also have areolar tissue. Okay, and then we have more epithelial tissue. So everything is got to work together in order for your body to work. And I'm not going to give you a picture like this. It's just to get the idea of what an organ is. Okay, now body membranes. I don't know if we've really talked about this. Okay, so there's 4 types of body membranes. Okay, so we have mucous membranes, serous membranes, cutaneous membranes, and synovial. So we're going to cover each one of those. Okay, so here's a big picture with it. Okay, so, and this kind of summarizes it totally, right? So a mucous membrane is at it, they're always at an opening to the outside. Okay, a serous membrane, these are going to line the body cavities. Okay, cutaneous membrane, that's your skin, right? That's the outside. And then synovial membranes, they're in your joints. So showing you in the knee. So really, this sums it up, right? Mucus, serous, cutaneous, and synovial. Okay, so mucosa, mucous membranes. So they're going to line stuff that's going to the outside. Okay, so any place where you have an opening that's going to the outside. So urinary, reproductive, respiratory, we're going to have mucous membranes. Okay, mucous membranes are going to absorb, protect, and secrete. Okay, I'm not so worried about this right now. Okay, so we have mucosa. So the mucosa are going to protect you. Okay, serous membranes, they line the body cavities. These kind of epithelium, it's simple squamous. What they reproduce is they produce this fluid that's called serous fluid. Serous fluid, do I have a picture? Nope, I deleted the picture. Serous fluid kind of acts as a lubricant. Okay, so I always think of it as, say, lubricant. Okay, so it comes from the plasma of your blood, and it's going to reduce the friction between the layers of your body. Okay, so pretend, I'm trying to draw lungs. Okay, so let's pretend this is the lung, right? And this is the thoracic cavity. So here's the visceral pleura, right? It's on this outside of your lungs, and then lining your thoracic cavity is your parietal pleura. Okay, both of these membranes secrete serous fluid. So they're secreting this serous fluid, and what it does is it's going to keep this from rubbing. So you can't feel when you take a breath. You don't feel your lungs rubbing against your thoracic cavity. You don't feel your heart beating in your chest. Okay, there is a disease called pleurisy. So pleurisy is inflammation of the pleura. Okay, so this becomes inflamed, and then you can actually feel your lungs rubbing your chest cavity, which is not good, right? That really hurts. Okay, and it's all from the simple squamous epithelium is what keeps that from happening. Okay, so cutaneous membranes, the skin, no big deal. It's got its own chapter. And then synovial membranes, we have them in some joints, and they're synovial fluid. Okay, and the idea behind this synovial fluid, it's gonna help supply the cartilage with food, nutrients, and remove waste. And it's also gonna help reduce friction between the bone. Okay, now I want you guys to get the idea of how tissue can change. Okay, so if your tissue gets bigger, those cells get bigger, that's called hypertrophy. Okay, so think about somebody exercising and they're making their muscles bigger. That's hypertrophy. Okay, hyperplasia is if you get too many cells. Okay, so maybe this is a tumor or a mass. So you get a increase in number of cells. Atrophy is when they shrink. Okay, so it could be because of normal aging, or it could be because you're not moving. You can't move. I'm not worried about stem cells, so don't worry about stem cells. Okay, now tissue modification, if we keep going, okay. One thing is called metaplasia. Okay, so metaplasia can happen if tissue starts changing. Okay, so an example in the book is smokers, when people smoke. Okay, so what happens is all the chemicals from the cigarettes, they come into the trachea and the epithelium. Normally what we have is this normal pseudostratified, ciliated columnar. Okay, so picture it. Okay, so here's pseudostratified cells, okay, with goblet cells making mucus, and they have cilia on them. Okay, what happens is that the chemicals in the cigarettes actually cause these cells to change. Okay, when the cells change, we get non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So they go from this to this, right? So they lose the cilia. They can't, well, we'll talk about the cilia. So they lose the cilia, they lose the goblet cells. It just totally changes. But what's cool is that if you stop smoking, right, the cells will revert back. Okay, dysplasia is abnormal tissue development. And the best thing I can think of is when they do a pap smear and they call you and they say, oh, listen, you have some abnormal cells. So what they're looking at is dysplasia. So it could be precancerous, so they'll remove the cells, right? And then everything can go back to normal. Usually it's from, now we know it's from HPV, which is the human papillomavirus. It can cause cervical cell dysplasia. Okay, neoplasia means you have abnormal tissue growth, and you could have tumors. So there's benign, which means it's not bad, right? It has localized growth. Usually they have a capsule around them and they're not spreading. Malignant means it can spread, and usually malignant is associated with cancer. Okay, but that's neoplasia, so new growth. And then we have dysplasia, which is abnormal development. Metaplasia is if it's changing. Okay, now necrosis is tissue death. Okay, so most of the time we can't fix it. Once tissue dies, we can't replace it. Okay, so I have a couple things in here. So gangrene is a type of tissue death. It can happen, there can be dry gangrene, there can be wet gangrene, but most of the time what's happening is you've lost a blood supply. Okay, so you don't have any blood going to the tissue and the tissue dies. And after the tissue dies, then you can get an infection, and then the infection could lead you to be septic, or you might just have to have that part removed. Okay, so gangrene is can be a part of diabetes if you're having damage to your toes and fingers and stuff like that. Feet. I know, I'm not too worried about this. It's kind of cool to think about it, but dry gangrene means it's dry. So that's when somebody gets frostbite. Okay, wet gangrene is slimy, right? And then gas gangrene is the bacteria can actually get in there and they make bubbles. And so it's kind of crackly, which is kind of gross, right? Okay, now I didn't want to talk about aging of tissues. Okay, so tissues do change with aging and it's sad, right? So the epithelium gets thinner. And you can think about this, think about someone elderly that you know. So the epithelium gets thinner, The connective tissue loses its resiliency, its elasticity. We don't have as much collagen. We start losing bone mass, and the muscles can get smaller. Okay, and for some reason, I have a whole nother set of the same slides on here. So that's it. That's it. So that's 83 slides, which is a lot. And so somehow I added 2 sets of them. I'm sorry. I'm having tech issues this semester. So that is it. Let me know if you have questions.